Welcome to another PureRead audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted PureRead Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Amish Light, an Amish Romance by Grace Given. Chapter 1, Haunted. Rebekah Byler sat up with a start. The dreams of her encounter with the man in her bedroom that long ago afternoon recently recurred. At the time, she was following orders for bed rest before her youngest child, Abram, was born. In her dreams, she vividly saw the man's face frozen in her mind. He stood and looked at her. His hollowed eyes held a chilling depth that paralyzed her senses. Jacob awoke and reached for his wife. "What is it, Rebekah?" He pulled her close and concern swept him when he felt her heart beat rapidly. "Everything is all right." Rebekah breathed her first deep breath of air since waking. "I do not know why I continue to experience these nightmares. Jacob, I know that the man is long gone and out of our lives, but for some reason he remains with me." Jacob wrapped his arms around her tighter. He began to pray and felt her relax in his embrace. Finally, she drifted off into a peaceful sleep once more. The next morning, Jacob and Samuel finished the early morning chores in the barn. Samuel left for school and Jacob told Rebekah he had an errand to do. He hitched the open buggy to one of the horses and left for his father-in-law's parsonage. Bishop Daniel Stoltzfus led the Amish community and possessed a unique understanding of his church members. Jacob did not know what to do to prevent Rebekah's recent dreams. They had prayed often about the situation. Nothing seemed to help. He once felt she was getting over the situation, but for some reason, after several months of no disturbing dreams, she began to have nightmares again. Daniel came from the back door when Jacob arrived. He greeted him and together they went into the house. Claire offered her son-in-law coffee and excused herself. She knew this was not a family visit when she saw Jacob's face. "I want you to stay, Claire," said Jacob. "Daniel and I have something to tell you that I do not think you know about." Clara sat down. "Do you remember when Rebekah needed bed rest before our Abram was born?" She nodded. "Did anyone tell you what happened one afternoon when she was alone in our house?" Unknown to her husband, or Rebekah's husband, Claire's daughter confided in her several days after the incident. She thanked her God daily for arriving in time for the man to escape unseen by her and Rebekah's children, Samuel and Hannah. She had driven the little ones home after spending the day with her. She recalled vividly how upset her daughter appeared when they came into the bedroom. Rebekah assured her everything was fine. Clara did not pursue it, but later Rebekah told her what had happened. Now Clara spoke. "Rebekah told me several days after the event. She did not want me to speak of it with either of you, though I was sure she told you, Jacob." The bishop sat in silence. He held much in his heart and mind in regard to the wayward young man who did more to the Bylers than appeared in that bedroom. It was finally time to reveal what he was aware of. First, he must make Clara and Jacob promise his words would not leave the parsonage kitchen. Then he spoke. "Jacob, the night your barn exploded and burned to the ground, your dad and I discovered what caused it." Jacob reminded him that he knew a bomb had been set. Daniel nodded and continued. "The man who committed the act confessed it to me. He received counseling from me for several months off and on. I know who did it, but I have forgiven him," said Jacob. "We have a new barn thanks to our neighbors. Over 2 years have passed since it happened." Jacob looked at the bishop and then he continued. Matthew Lapp stopped months later to tell me he had done it. He asked forgiveness. I forgave him and said nothing further about the matter. At the time, he was under counseling from you. I felt he was on the right track. Who was the person who scared Rebekah that day when she rested? Asked Clara. She did not wish to tell me his name. It was Matthew Lapp, said Jacob. The bishop and the elders decided not to press charges with the local town police. That had been their decision when someone, now then known to be Matthew Lapp, set the explosion that burned the structure. Everyone in the group knew it was not the Amish way to take anyone to court in the English world. Instead, the bishop and one of the elders met privately with the unpredictable young Amish man. To Daniel's knowledge, Matthew had not repeated the harassment. Clara whispered a soft prayer of forgiveness for Matthew. His widowed mother had done all she knew to do in behalf of her son. His sister, Katie, worked in Rebekah's sewing shop. Matthew's name was no longer mentioned by his family. The three sitting there were well aware that Matthew left the community for the outside world. He slept in an Englisher's barn at night until the man ran him off. With revenge in his heart, Matthew returned and set the Englisher's barn on fire. This was something the farmer could not tolerate. Matthew is in prison now for arson, said Jacob. I say this to emphasize he is no longer a threat to our community or my family. The look in his eyes pled with his in-laws. I am here now to ask for counsel for Rebekah, said Jacob. She has suddenly begun to have nightmares about Matthew Lapp. They are so bad that she awakens in a trembling state. I don't know what has brought them on again. I know he is in jail and so has not returned to upset her. Clara's and Daniel's eyes filled with concern. Rebekah was so busy with her 3 children and her sewing shop, they felt she had little time to think about past experiences that were unique to Amish households. Today is Rebekah's day at the shop for the full day. Said Claire, we will close the shop at noon and eat our dinner together. I will speak to her then. Her glance moved to Daniel, who nodded his approval. Katie will not be in today, which will permit us to speak in private. She explained Hannah and Abram would not be there either since Rebekah's best friend, Nancy Schrock, offered to bring them to her house. She had 2 children of her own who were the same age as Rebekah's. Jacob stood up and thanked his in-laws for their support. The other 2 stood, and Bishop Stoltzfus bowed his head and praised their God for his goodness in the situation. Jacob returned to his chores with a lighter heart. After several days of rain the previous week, the hay finally dried out, ready to be baled. He thanked his God that the early August sun receded somewhat with its heat. A young neighbor, Zeb Bernhard, arrived to help with the baling. He was eager to get started and once told Jacob he hoped to have a farm of his own when he was older. Jacob smiled at the 13-year-old and encouraged him to learn all he could about farming. Chapter 2: A Harvest of Trouble. Clara Stoltzfus sat in the back room with her daughter. Rebekah was puzzled why they closed the shop for dinner. Usually, they took turns eating and business was not interrupted. Clara had started chicken and dumplings the night before. She made enough for Daniel to have at home. Rebekah knew Jacob was working hard in the alfalfa field with Zeb. She left beef stew, potatoes, and plenty of side dishes in the icebox for both of them to reheat on the stove at noon. "What is it, Mom?" Rebekah asked. "I wish to speak to you about what is troubling you, Doctor." Clara smiled. "Jacob spoke with your dad and me early this morning. Why have your nightmares returned? If you fear someone or something, we must trust in God to replace the fears with trust in Him." Rebekah bowed her head. She felt shame rush over her. "I have not trusted God enough. I know He does not allow fear to come into our lives. I have prayed, and Jacob has done so as well. Perhaps my faith should be stronger." She looked at her mother. "I do not know what causes the restlessness I feel at nighttime. I know Matthew Lapp is in the English jail, yet he centers in my dreams." Clara reached for her daughter's hand. "Right now we will pray for Matthew. Even though he is in prison, we must trust he will find his way back with God's help. Then we will pray for you. You must let go of past events." They had just bowed their heads when a pounding on the shop door distracted them. They rushed to the door. Zeb Bernhard continued to pound the glass window. Clara opened the door quickly. "Zeb, you will break the glass," she said. "What is it?" "It is Jacob. He slipped and fell into the hay baler. I was able to drag him out right away, but he is not waking up." Rebekah's heart leapt to her throat. Hands trembled when she reached the telephone on the wall, used for emergencies. She dropped the receiver twice and tried to grasp it the third time with moist hands. Clara rushed to her and told her to hurry to Jacob. Clara dialed the English doctor's number. Dr. Anderson was young, but proved on several occasions he could meet the needs of the Amish community. Rebekah raced across the pasture to their farm and, without knowing how she did it, she reached the still body of her husband. After what seemed an endless time, Dr. Anderson arrived. Rebekah looked up to see him and both her parents. She moved back at the doctor's request. After examining Jacob, Dr. Anderson looked at Rebekah. Rebekah read signs of something serious in his eyes. She had seen the same look when her first husband, Eli Stauffer, lay dying in the hospital bed. Turmoil ran havoc inside her, and her silent voice raged at the God she believed in. Clara knelt beside her daughter and lifted her chin to face her mother. "Calm down, Rebekah. Your dad and I will go with you. They are taking Jacob to the hospital." It was then she noticed an English ambulance in the field. Jacob was lifted inside it. The paramedics and their actions were blurred. Daniel and Clara lifted Rebekah from the ground and led her to the buggy. They arrived at the general store in town, where an Englisher, Thomas McCoy, quickly reassured the three Amish people. He told them to get into his car. He then drove them the rest of the way to the local hospital. When they entered the lobby, Rebekah swayed. Daniel caught her in time and he led her to a nearby chair. "Rebekah, your mom will stay here with you. I will get some water for you." "I have something for her," said a voice. It was the volunteer who sat behind the desk. She handed Daniel a paper cup filled with water. Daniel thanked her and took it to his daughter. "Do you wish to have her checked out by a nurse?" asked the woman. Her name tag read Evelyn. "I am fine," said Rebekah. She drank the water as instructed. "Danke for your kindness," she said to Evelyn. Rebekah vowed to be strong. She must get to Jacob. The family approached Evelyn. "Do you know where Rebekah Byler is?" Daniel asked. Evelyn thumbed through cards. "These cards will tell me the latest patients to arrive. Of course, they will go into the computer." The blank looks on the faces in front of her told her that this information was of little consequence to them. "Here he is," she said. "He is in room 253. She directed them to the elevator. Rebekah paid little attention to her directions. She knew the elevator location as well as the layout of the hospital. Inside the elevator, Clara reached for her daughter's hand. She felt clammy hands and cold fingers. She felt clammy hands and cold fingers. Clara squeezed Rebekah's hand while she and Daniel prayed aloud. No words came from Rebekah's mouth. Her mind saw Eli's ashen face. That face transferred to Jacob. The elevator doors opened and they stepped into the hall on the second floor. "It is down here," said Daniel. When they got to the door of Jacob's room, a nurse stopped them. "I am sorry. You will have to wait until the doctor is ready for you to see him," said Bessie Whitney, RN. Bessie looked at Rebekah, and full recognition came to her. She extended her hand to her. "I am so sorry, Rebekah. I am sure he will be fine." Rebekah managed a weak smile. She was glad that Bessie was still on this floor. At one time, this nurse was the one who consistently supported her during the long hours spent by Eli's bedside. Bessie was the one who also hugged her close when Eli took his last breath. She had told Bessie the story of how close she, Jacob, Nancy, and Eli were growing up. She came to rely on the nurse to keep her updated on Eli's condition. Now, Bessie led them 2 doors down to a small waiting room. She left and then returned with 3 steaming cups of coffee. Clara thanked her and encouraged her daughter to drink the hot liquid. Dr. Anderson was told the location of Jacob's family. He found them deep in prayer. He knew that for the moment, that was the only hope for Jacob's recovery. They looked at him with expectation and a glimmer of hope in their eyes. "Jacob has suffered an upper body injury," he said. "It is very serious. I do not yet know if it is life-threatening. He was very lucky the young man was right there to pull him from the Bel Air." The cluster of Amish in front of him knew luck had nothing to do with it, but they appreciated the doctor's words. The English way proved different from theirs, but all recalled the good care Eli received. Dr. Anderson had also delivered Amish babies, including Rebekah's last 2, Hannah and Abram. "When may we see him?" asked Rebekah. "You can go in now, but only for a short visit. In a few minutes, we will take him to the operating room." Rebekah numbly approached Jacob's bed. She took his hand. They communicated with their eyes. Jacob found it hard to keep his open. She leaned down and kissed him. It was time for surgery, and she whispered in his ear, proclaiming her love for him. After a few hours, the family was told Jacob was out of surgery, but lapsed into unconsciousness. Dr. Anderson allowed Rebekah to see her husband. She gasped when she looked at Jacob. Her eyes followed tubes to his body. The white chenille cover and tanned face contrasted sharply. Sandy hair was disheveled. She knelt beside his bed and took his hand in hers. She knew he had no means to convey the strength she usually felt from him. Clara pulled a chair to the bedside and told Rebekah to sit in it. When 15 minutes passed, Bessie returned and told them to leave the room. "He needs quiet to heal along with medical care." She gently took Rebekah's arm and had her by her side. At the door, Bessie stopped and turned to Jacob. She thought she heard a soft gasp. "He appears to be awakening," she said. Rebekah jerked her head around and saw Jacob's eyes open and then close again. "I must stay by his side," she said. Bessie looked at her and then at the patient. She fully understood Rebekah's need and hoped the outcome for Jacob would be much different than that of Eli Stauffer. Bessie told her to sit and talk with Jacob. "That will help him to awaken completely. He will hear your voice and want to converse back with you," said Bessie. She then told the rest of the family to wait in the lounge. She promised she would keep them updated. When Clara and Daniel returned to the sitting room, they saw several Amish families there praying for Jacob. Zeb Bernhard spread the word quickly and asked for prayers from each of them. Rebekah took Jacob's hand once more. She spoke with him. "Jacob, you must wake up. Your family needs you." She continued to beg him to open his eyes and hold them open. "I need you, Jacob." Jacob tried to shift, and Rebekah noticed this only because the weak grip in her hand nudged slightly. She continued to talk to him as Bessie instructed. She vowed to do anything asked of her if it meant she would have Jacob back and well again. Jacob groaned softly. Finally, he opened his eyes and met his wife's face. He appeared bewildered. "You had an accident with the baler, Jacob. Zeb ran to the shop to give us the news. He was able to pull you from it right away. Rebekah did not want to go into detail. If she upset him in any way, it would be her fault if he declined further." Rebekah attempted a reassuring smile. She believed Jacob would recover. Rebekah told herself she must cling to that hope. She bowed her head and prayed aloud. Jacob tried to join her, but only a disjointed whisper came from him. His mind swirled in confusion. He did not recall any of what Rebekah told him. Chapter 3. Rebekah's Burden. Several days passed as Rebekah sat by the bedside of Jacob. Familiar sounds and smells of the hospital became the norm. Clara and Daniel took her children to the parsonage. They made sure Samuel left for school each day, and that Hannah and Abram went to the sewing shop with her. Katie Lapp worked hard at the shop and had learned the skills of cutting material and waiting on customers. Everyone asked about Jacob when they came in. The Amish community once again rallied around the Byler family. Several men, along with Zeb, finished baling the hay. Bales littered the field until completely dried out before storage in the shed. Zeb took the wagon out and gathered loose hay. He then took it to the hayloft. The animals would have plenty of fodder for the upcoming winter months. When Marion Lapp was not at work at the bed and breakfast in town, she could be found with other women taking care of Rebekah's garden. They canned produce for her. At the same time, they tended to their own chores at home. Rebekah sat at Jacob's bedside. He could speak, but not for long periods. He was on an IUV, drip for pain, and was often too drowsy to complete sentences. She heard her mother's voice at the door of the room. Clara walked in and told Rebekah to take a break in the dining room of the hospital. "You need nourishment, doctor," said Clara. "If you do not keep your own strength up, you will not be able to care for Jacob when he gets home." Bessie came into the room behind Clara. "She is right, Rebekah. I will go to the cafeteria with you. I'll make sure you eat a good meal." Rebekah realized she was outnumbered. She bent to kiss Jacob. Clara pulled yarn and needles from her bag and settled next to her son-in-law. As she knitted, she told him of recent happenings in the community. She updated him on progress at his farm. She told him that Nancy Schrock had the children so Clara could come and visit him. He smiled weakly and thanked her. When Rebekah and Bessie returned to the second floor, Bessie went behind the nurse's station and pulled Jacob Byler's chart. She made notes while Rebekah turned to go into his room. A nurse pulled Bessie aside. "There is more bad news for the Byler family," she said in a low voice. "Their baby was just brought in for treatment." Bessie stared at her. She recalled the difficult birth of Abram Byler. Rebekah spent hours, days, and weeks nurturing him to health. "What is wrong with him?" Bessie asked. "I believe it is pneumonia," she said. "I'm not his nurse, but I heard the doctor say that." Bessie questioned whether the Bylers knew he had been brought in or not. The nurse shook her head. "He just arrived." Bessie hurried to the small waiting room. Jacob's parents, Martha and Mark Byler, sat there with several other Amish men and women. She asked if Claire was in the hospital. "She is with Jacob, waiting for Rebekah to come back." Martha Byler looked intently at Bessie. "Is something wrong with Jacob?" "It's not Jacob." Bessie led the couple to the hallway. She saw Clara leaving Jacob's room and waited for her. When Clara joined them, Bessie spoke. Abram was just admitted to the hospital, she said. He just arrived, and so I do not have details. I am certain that Rebekah and Jacob do not have the word yet. Clara sensed that Bessie waited for advice on how they wished for this to be handled. Is Jacob strong enough to handle this news? Clara asked. Before you go in, I'll consult with Dr. Anderson. I'm sure he will want to meet with you. He is not treating Abram, but is close to the case. In a short time, Dr. Anderson approached the waiting room. The Bylers and Clara went into the hall. If you wish to tell Rebekah and Jacob the news of their son, it will be fine. I want to be nearby when you do so. I am not sure how much they will be able to handle at this point. Jacob is not out of the woods yet either. Bishop Daniel Stoltzfus came down the hallway just as the doctor finished his words. Clara quickly told him the news. He drew the Amish visitors together, and they prayed for strength for the Bylers. Then he, Clara, Martha, and Mark went to Jacob's room. Dr. Anderson followed and stood in the doorway. Rebekah's face lit with concern when all four walked in. The fact that Dr. Anderson stood waiting told her Jacob's condition worsened. It seemed her heart stopped beating. We have news to tell you both, said Clara. Nancy had to send for the doctor to treat Abram. He was just brought here. Rebekah's eyes filled with fear. He has pneumonia and will be treated. Rebekah recalled instances where Amish children and adults suffered through pneumonia, but she had never known of any of them to be admitted to the hospital for it. They followed the doctor's orders or took care of those who contracted the disease in the Amish ways of healing. They used a mixture of herbs and potions handed down to them over the generations. Dr. Anderson read the question on Rebekah's face. We have Abram here on the pediatric wing. With his early history, we felt it best to give him treatment here. Dr. Anderson could not reassure the parents that their child would recover. The baby was weak and very ill. For now, he kept these facts to himself. Abram's birth and early months had been hard, and he had only made it this far as a result of his nurturing mother. Now, at age 2, the child still had the tendency to get colds and upper respiratory conditions easier than most children. The pediatrician, Dr. Josh Mellon, was made aware of Jacob's accident. I must see Abram, said Rebekah. She moved her head from Jacob to the doctor and back again. It felt as if her heart had been ripped apart in 2 pieces. I will take you down there, said Dr. Anderson. He looked at Jacob. Pain crossed the eyes of his patient along with frustration. The doctor left him with his family. He was once again reminded that prayer was all they had until Abram and Jacob both passed the crucial point to recovery. When they entered the pediatric wing, Rebekah's steps picked up faster. The nurse at the station quickly nodded when Dr. Anderson asked for Abram's room number. The child was in a small bed that had rails on it. His face flushed with fever. Several other children were in the room in their own beds. One coughed again and again until the nurse gave him something to soothe his small lungs. Rebekah rushed to Abram. She picked him up and held him close to her. The child relaxed and smiled in his mother's arms. The pediatrician walked in and was introduced to the Amish woman. He assured her they were doing everything possible to heal her son. He will be on the mend soon. Children have a way of bouncing back. Dr. Medlin's shock of black hair framed cobalt blue eyes. He was athletic and handsome. Rebekah noticed his looks, but was more intent on her son. Will you get his fever down soon? She asked. Then a thought entered her head. Can he be put in the same room as my husband's? We may consider that for later. For now, he must stay here. He is in a quarantined room where he will get care appropriate for small children. When the doctor left, Rebekah was oblivious to anyone around her. She must care for her small son. Perhaps she could take him home and care for him properly there. She thought he would surely thrive better at home in her care than in this sterile room. She had means to care for him. After all, it was Rebekah who nourished him to full health when a baby. "Rebekah, I want to give you something for your nerves," said Dr. Anderson. "You are facing more than you should have to, and it will help you cope." Rebekah shook her head. No. She witnessed the medications her husband received and how much it subdued him. Jacob slept more often than he was awake. She could not risk that outcome for herself. After a while, a nurse appeared and told Rebekah she must leave. Rebekah did not want to leave her son. He and Jacob must get well soon. She would care for her husband and her child. They belonged with their family, and she needed them both. At the urging of the doctor, Rebekah reluctantly handed her son over to the nurse. Chapter 4. A Life Embraced. Another week passed. Jacob improved. Abram became better each day, but he was still weak. Rebekah failed to convince the doctors or her family that her child would thrive much faster if at home where he belonged. She sat at Jacob's side and gave him the latest reports on their son. While Jacob agreed that Abram should remain where he was for a while longer, he also felt the intense pain of Rebekah. The Amish community took care of things on the farm, and his in-laws took care of the children with help from his own parents. Jacob realized it was all they could do. He felt better and knew he improved since he was as anxious to get back home as Rebekah was to get their family back together again. Rebekah pulled her woolen coat tighter when she stepped from the hospital into the cold air that pushed in from the north. Leaves fell onto the ground. Their muted colors formed mats on the hard earth. Clara had called Thomas McCoy to pick them up today and take them home. She convinced Rebekah to stay home until the next day. She had lost weight and did not eat properly. Clara felt a good home-cooked meal or two would improve her daughter's well-being. She also planned to have Hannah and Samuel home in their beds that night. Clara reminded Rebekah her children were excited to have their mother home. For the first time in a long while, Rebekah realized Hannah and Samuel needed her as much as Jacob and Abram. When Rebekah and Clara came into the kitchen, Rebekah smiled. Hannah and Samuel ran to meet her, forgetting all rules of not running in the house. Nancy's face was rosy as she stirred the gravy. The aromas of an Amish home-cooked meal drew Rebekah as a magnet to metal. Her mother had been right. Coming home made everything seem possible for her. "It smells so good, Nancy," said Rebekah. She hugged her friend. Rows of vegetables in jars lined the far counter. It dawned on Rebekah she had missed harvesting the fall produce. Even canning the bounty had not been on her mind. "Who took care of my garden?" she asked. Nancy and Clara laughed. "Everyone," said Nancy. "We took turns and all of your canning is finished. These jars just have to go into the cellar for winter. We did not know which vegetables you wanted out to use the next few weeks," said Clara. Rebekah could not remember the last time she felt so at peace. This time, she was the one who suggested they pray. She gathered Hannah and Samuel to the kitchen. They all bowed their heads and prayed in thanks for their God's goodness to them all. Hannah then quickly helped set the table for all of them. When they finished eating, Rebekah looked at Nancy. "You must take some of this food home for Isaac." "Has he had any hot meals since you have been so busy taking care of us?" asked Rebekah. "Jay, he is taken care of. Just about everyone has been looking after my family as well." That night, Rebekah sank into the feather bed. The woolen coverlet gave warmth. She reached her hand across to Jacob's side of the bed and knew he was there with her in spirit. That night, deep sleep took over. The next morning, she awoke with a start. Sun rays filtered through the gauzed curtains of her bedroom. She heard her children's voices from the kitchen. Clara smiled when she noted the clock on the kitchen wall read 8:30. She smiled broader when her daughter hurried into the kitchen. "I have coffee for you," said Clara. "We made cinnamon rolls for you," said Hannah. "I milked the cows by myself," said Samuel. Rebekah did not speak of her extreme oversleeping. Claire was happy to see her daughter so relaxed. She knew Rebekah would want to return to the hospital soon. Hannah and Samuel helped clear the table. They went into the sitting room to play. Rebekah noticed Samuel reached for Jacob's Bible. She listened as he read to Hannah. "We must have a gut talk," said Clara. She poured coffee for both of them. "I spoke with Dr. Anderson yesterday. He feels Jacob may be ready to come home in about a week. He is not able to do chores of any kind yet, but at least he will be home with you and the Kinner." Rebekah's eyes lit up. "What about Abram? I cannot leave him alone in the hospital." "The doctors feel the same way. Our Abram is also improving. Dr. Medlin is convinced he will be fine with gut care here at home." "He did not seem all that convinced when I last spoke with him," Rebekah said. Clara laughed. "Well, it took some persuading. Dr. Anderson helped along those lines, too." By the time Rebekah kissed her children goodbye, Thomas parked in the driveway. She was glad she would be going to the hospital in an Englisher's car rather than a slow buggy this time. She could not wait to give Jacob the news. When Rebekah came to the door of the hospital room, Jacob knew she had the good news. Dr. Anderson spoke a long time with him earlier that morning. Jacob was to allow a therapist to come to his home for several weeks during recovery. He told Jacob if he did not agree, then he must stay in the hospital so he could receive it. Jacob quickly agreed. They discussed what he could be doing in between the therapist's visits to improve. "It will be 3 days a week for a month," said Dr. Anderson. Anything was fine with Jacob if he could get back home again. "You are going home, Jacob," said Rebekah. "Abram is coming with us. You will be here for 2 more days. I am so happy. God has answered our prayers. He is always the one in control of everything, my Freya. We must always trust in his guidance." Jacob felt his wife's relief. During his stay, he worried more that Rebekah would lose him like Eli than he did anything else. When he could not verbally speak to her, Jacob silently prayed to his gut. "You are right, Jacob. There were many times I felt powerless. I wanted to shout at everyone who kept telling me I needed rest. I felt no one understood that I needed to be by 2 bedsides. I could not leave Abram alone, and they would not allow him be taken care of in your room." Jacob reached for her hand. "That is all past us now, Rebekah. Do not rake over past events. We may never know the reasons we have been put through these trials, but there is always a reason. We should recall only the blessings of the hard times, not the bad parts." Dr. Anderson entered the room. He was pleased to see the couple so happy. It convinced him even more that Jacob and Abram would regain health faster at home. "I believe I will discharge you first thing tomorrow morning, Jacob," he said. "I'll do that unless you prefer to stay here. I am thankful for the care I have received, but I am ready to give up this bed." Jacob smiled. As they spoke, Bessie came into the room. She pushed a toddler's bed with a small child in it. Dr. Anderson turned and helped her complete the journey. Rebekah swept across the room and scooped Abram into her arms. He no longer felt warm with fever, and she took him to Jacob. Abram sat on his bed and then hugged his father. All was right again in the Byler family. "Why did you bring his bed?" Rebekah asked Bessie. "Since it is his last night, he will stay in here with his father. We'll know where they both are when time for discharge arrives." Bessie smiled. "We wouldn't want to leave one behind by mistake." "I do not believe Rebekah would go home without us both," said Jacob. "You are right, Jacob," said Rebekah. "I would never leave here with only one of you." Dr. Anderson left the room. Bessie gave Rebekah a long hug. "You are a brave and good woman, Rebekah. I'm happy everything worked out so well for all of you." Thomas drove Rebekah back home in the early evening. "It looks like someone is keeping house for you," he said. Lanterns lit in 2 rooms of the house. Rebekah thanked Thomas and offered supper to him. He declined but promised to be back the next morning. Thomas doubted Jacob would be ready to tolerate a boogie ride until much later. In times past, they paid him when they needed to hire him for longer trips. During the time of the Byler's crisis, Thomas insisted they did not owe him to take them to the hospital when needed. Rebekah knew her mother would be at the stove and getting ready to set supper on the table. She was surprised and happy to see her grandmother, Sarah Stoltzfus, there as well. Sarah visited a few times in the hospital, but her frail health prevented her from doing what she wanted to do for her granddaughter and her family. She occupied a small house behind Rebekah's and Jacob's. She remained there, close to family after her husband John passed away 2 years ago. Now she beamed to see Rebekah so happy once again. Clara turned from the kitchen window to greet her daughter. She dismissed thoughts that someone hurried around the side of the barn. She decided Zeb was doing last-minute checkups at the barn. "Welcome home, Doctor," she said. She gave Rebekah a quick hug. They sat at the table where so many family meals occurred. Rebekah prayed the prayer before the meal. She realized when she finished she prayed as long as her dad often did. She had so much to praise her gut for that it was hard to stop. When she finished, she glanced lovingly at her children. She felt assured things would be back to normal soon. That night, when Rebekah led her children in prayer, she knew her God would protect her family from all evil. He healed Jacob and Abram. He always made things right again, as promised so often in the Bible. She must learn to trust him with her whole heart. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Darkness. Once Jacob and Abram arrived home, the Amish community filtered in and out of the house with home-cooked meals. 2 of the women helped Rebekah on her laundry day. The day was sunny and not as cool as autumn could be at times. The laundry dried quickly, and later in the day, others came to help her take it down. Katie and Clara took care of her sewing shop, but Rebekah hoped she could soon get back to it. She must first care for her family. By now, she was getting into a routine at home. Samuel continued to go to school. Hannah often went to the sewing shop with Clara. Abram slept through both daily naps with no problem. The therapist came faithfully for an hour 3 times a week. Jacob improved, and he and Samuel once again milked the cows together. That was all he was allowed to do. He regretted the workload of Rebekah and realized there was much to care for in running a household. She nurtured Abram, who regained a little of his robust nature each day. The doctor agreed the child was almost back to his optimal health level. "I am sorry you have so much work to do, along with caring for me and Abram," said Jacob. "I am fine and happy to have you both home again," said Rebekah. She appreciated Jacob when he was well and helped her when not busy with farm work and chores. Not every Amish woman had support from their husbands as she did from Jacob. "I will have you back helping me before you know it." Her eyes held teasing that Jacob cherished in her. One evening, Jacob sat at the kitchen table with his wife, after the children had gone to bed. They talked of their caring neighbors. Because of them, The Bylers had plenty of hay for their animals and food for themselves. I know that Zeb and his dad, Nathaniel, have been helping Marion lap on her small farm. I miss checking on the family, though." Rebekah agreed. She had news for Jacob. "Did you know that Nathaniel has asked Marion to marry him?" Jacob did not know this. They will marry at the end of November. After that, they will live on the Lap property, though I believe they plan to sell that farm and settle on Nathaniel's farm. Jacob was happy for Marion. Nathaniel would combine Zeb and his daughter, Ruby, age 17, to the Lap household. His wife passed away several years previous. Nathaniel was grateful. His sister spent time with Ruby teaching her the duties of an Amish woman. "I have more gut news," said Rebekah. "Katie Lapp is engaged to marry John Byler." "That is all gut news," Jacob said. "Are they going to marry when Marion and Nathaniel do?" "They will not marry until next year," said Rebekah. "They just became engaged. They are taking lessons from my dade. John will be baptized with Katie 2 weeks from now. I am so happy things are working well for the Lapp family again." Neither mentioned the wayward son, Matthew, except to continue to pray for him and trust that their God would restore faith in the young man. They never discussed how Matthew may be living while incarcerated. They had no idea what the inside of prison looked like or what inmates did to pass time. Those thoughts never entered their minds. Jacob stood. His eyes rested on the jars of vegetables on the counter. "You will probably need to save a couple of the jars for wedding presents." Rebekah agreed with him. She told him she was sewing a coverlet for Katie. She wanted to work on it while at the shop in between customers, but with Katie working there, she would not dare bring it in with her. While at home, Rebekah had time to sew her gift. Katie helped her mother sew a simple dark blue dress for her own wedding in November. They were like best friends talking of their wedding days rather than mother and daughter. Rebekah hoped Nathaniel and his children would restore happiness to Marion. It could not be easy for her knowing her son ended up a criminal in the outside world. Rebekah went ahead to their bedroom. Jacob leaned over to dim the lantern until the kitchen was dark. He glanced out the window. The moon was full and lit the yard enough to outline objects. The plow, the buggy, and the long-handled rake rested against the barn in the near darkness. Jacob was pleased at the way neighbors pitched in to make sure his farm thrived when he could do nothing toward that goal. He thought how beautiful the night was and praised his God for his handiwork. He turned from the window to follow his wife when something caught his eye. He was sure a shadow moved. It was too large for small animals that sometimes scurried around at night. He peered out again. There was no movement, but he was sure he had seen someone slither around the side of the barn. His thoughts went to Rebekah. He had no intentions of disturbing her peace with his suspicions. He paused and thought about his wife's sudden recurring dreams. Had Rebekah seen or felt the presence of someone on their premises? He decided to let whoever it was to have a night's sleep in the hayloft. Tomorrow he would investigate thoroughly. The next morning, Jacob was impatient to get to the barn. He and Samuel made their way to the cows in their stalls. They milked the animals. Jacob allowed his eyes to rove around the barn. Hay from the loft had sifted onto the barn floor. Other than that, there was nothing that told him someone had been there. He focused on his son's conversation. "We are practicing for our Christmas program at school today," Samuel said. "You are doing that so soon. We still have Thanksgiving to celebrate." Samuel shook his head. "Jay, I know that, but Esther wants us to have the very best Christmas program of all this year. That is why we must practice hard." Jacob smiled at Samuel's enthusiasm. "That is gut," he said. "If we want to do a gut job, it takes practice." They returned with their milk pails to the house, where Samuel and Jacob strained it and then poured it into large jars. Samuel placed each in the icebox. "I think Mam and Hannah will have churning to do today," said Samuel. Rebekah felt a moisture creep behind her eyelids. Her son was growing up fast. At age 8, he experienced a confidence that placed him older than his chronological age. She agreed with him that there was enough milk in the icebox to start the churning. "We will need to churn some and put the butter into the cool cellar." "We will have plenty of food for winter," said Rebekah. "I will help, ma'am," said Hannah. "I know how to churn." At age 4, her daughter showed excitement when it came to learning new skills for her future. At the same time, Rebekah often noted Hannah tended to wander off to a pasture or to the edge of the woods. She would look at the sky and then twirl around with joy. Hannah reminded Rebekah of herself when she did the same thing. The difference was her child looked forward to learning the Amish way of keeping a home. In her youth, Rebekah did not like doing chores. Her mother reminded her more than once she would need them someday when she started her own family and household. Now Rebekah understood why her mother pushed her in this manner. After breakfast, Jacob told Rebekah he would be in the barn for a while. She looked at him with concern. "Do you think that is wise? I know the therapist will not be here today, but I fear you will do too much." Jacob bent to kiss his wife. "Do not worry. I know I have another week before I can do anything strenuous. I will merely take stock of what is needed to do when I am physically ready again. Zeb will be here today. If something is needed right away, he will do it." Rebekah was very happy. Zeb continued to help Jacob. He usually worked on the Byler farm during planting and harvesting. After Jacob's accident, he took over late fall chores. He mended a fence on the south side of the alfalfa field. The crop would regenerate itself in the spring. This meant that pasture would not have to be planted again next season. She watched her husband as he headed for the barn. When Jacob arrived, Zeb was busy cleaning stalls. He had let the cows out, and Jacob could hear humming. Zeb's voice was a rich baritone and was obvious to the Amish members in church. Zeb sang softly and stopped when he saw Jacob. "God gave you a beautiful voice, Zeb. I recognized the hymn you hummed. It is always gut to give praise to God. We have much to be thankful for." The warmth in Zeb's cheeks collided with the cold outside temperatures. He returned to his chore. Jacob walked around the barn. He then went outside and looked for any sign someone had actually been there the night before. The wind rustled fallen leaves behind his steps. Jacob saw nothing outside to indicate he had seen someone lurking around. He came back in and climbed the ladder to the loft. Zeb started to caution him due to his injury. Instead, he watched Jacob ascend slowly. At the top, Jacob pulled himself up onto the loft floor. Loose hay scattered around the sunken mound of dried grass. Chapter 6. Escape. Jacob had plenty of time to observe and walk around his property while healing. Rebekah noted his improvement in gait. The therapist came for the last time. Jacob grew impatient to return to normal jobs around his farm. He wanted to rake the alfalfa field once more. By turning over the soil and stubble, he was assured of bounty by next summer. He watched at night to see if anyone came around. It was not easy to keep vigil. He had to think up excuses to either delay bedtime a few minutes or why he arose in the middle of the night. After the second time telling Rebekah he wanted to drink a glass of milk at 11 o'clock, he did not miss her questioning manner. After the last time, he decided to wait until he knew she slept soundly. He then got up and walked to the kitchen window. He became adept in the darkness at stepping over each of the 2 creaking boards outside the bedroom door. After a week of investigation, Jacob decided whoever it had been stayed one night only. Relieved he did not have to give excuses to Rebekah, he slept through the nights that followed. One morning after breakfast, Rebekah remarked she was glad he was sleeping all night. "It tells me you are feeling better and sleeping well, instead of roaming around the house in the middle of the night," she said. Jacob joined her in the laughter. He was happy Rebekah had not had nightmares again since he was discharged from the hospital. That evening, Rebekah asked Hannah to help her set the table. The child learned to place the silverware where it belonged at each place. She was allowed to set a plate at a time between the utensils, each task completed. Hannah asked for more supper-time chores. Rebekah handed her the basket of rolls. One rolled out as she stood on tiptoe to push it to the center of the table. "You do not have to place them in the middle of the table. Put them by your dad's place. He will pass them around for us," said Rebekah. She looked at her family around the table. All bowed their heads as Jacob prayed the prayer of thanksgiving for their bounty. Samuel eagerly told them the progress of the Christmas program. Hannah spoke up about her responsibilities at home that day. Suddenly, their pleasant meal was interrupted by distant sirens. The Amish experienced the sirens only once before in their community. It happened 8 years ago when an Englisher was on the run and found his escape in the fields and barns. Rebekah mentally recalled the flashing lights and loud warnings. The children held their spoons and forks in midair, eyes rounded like saucers. Jacob quickly reassured his family. "We will know soon enough why the police cars from town are here." Rebekah and Jacob carried on in usual manner. They engaged the children in conversation throughout supper. Jacob told Rebekah she cooked a fine meal. Samuel and Hannah took their plates to the counter. Rebekah cleared the rest of the table, and Jacob went into the sitting room. He watched 2 more cars with lights flashing and sirens blasting on the road in front of their property, and his eyes followed them to the parsonage. He bumped the side table, causing the Bible to land on the floor when he got closer to the window. He picked it up and put it back where it belonged. Watching the cars, he breathed a sigh of relief when he saw both of the latest arrivals to use the Stoltzfus driveway to turn around. They stopped on the road and several officers got out. They ran in different directions. The guns they held were not lost on Jacob. He prayed no one would be shot dead by the end of the siege. Most of all, he wondered why the mayhem was so necessary. He thought the noise and wild activity did not add anything to any possible reasons for the intrusion into the peaceful Amish community. Like the rest of the Amish, he did not go outside to satisfy curiosity. His thoughts were interrupted with the sound of a loud knock on the front door. Samuel and Hannah stood at the doorway between the sitting room and kitchen. Their eyes held a fear Jacob had never seen before. Rebekah took their hands and reassured them. When Jacob opened the door, he stepped back to invite the 2 uniformed men to enter. "We apologize for the intrusion, but have you seen anyone around your farm tonight?" The young officer shuffled his feet. "We are looking for an Englisher. We need to apprehend him as soon as possible." Jacob's mind went back to the shadow more than a week ago. He chose not to mention the incident since whoever it was had not returned. Not only that, he did not want to discuss the matter in front of his wife and children. In split seconds, he made up his mind. "Let us go outside where we can talk easily," said Jacob. The officers agreed, and Jacob closed the front door behind him. The older policeman knew the Amish man had seen something, but he waited for him to speak. "It was over a week ago, when I was sure I saw a man's shadow around our barn," said Jacob. I did not go out that night to investigate because I was still recuperating from a farm accident. Officer Joe Laughlin recalled an Amish man suffered a hay baling accident several weeks ago. I heard about the accident but did not know it was you. Can you describe the shape of the shadow? I mean, could you tell if it was someone tall or short? Any description at all is helpful. The only reason I noticed the person was because the moon was full that night. The yard was lit by the moon. I saw the shadow go around the backside door of the barn. After that night, I watched but did not see anything after that. Jacob paused. As for description, I have none to give you. It moved quickly and in semi-darkness. If you don't mind, we want to take a look around your property. Jacob nodded his assent and returned to his family. They are looking for an Englisher. I do not know why they are searching for him. They will be on our property for a little while. He looked at his children. Their small bodies appeared as statues. We do not have anything to worry about. This does not concern us. Let us say our nightly prayers now. Jacob focused on the reading. His voice and words soothed his family. When they finished, the children bounced back to their normal bedtime activities. Jacob and Rebekah kissed each child and pulled woolen coverlets over them. In very little time, each of the three slept soundly. The couple returned to the sitting room. Rebekah picked up the wedding present for Katie and began to sew. They did not speak of the surrounding activities. When they were ready for bed, Jacob put the lantern out. He glanced through the bedroom window. Sirens had ceased, but several patrol cars littered the road with lights on tops swirling. He climbed into bed beside his wife. They had no idea what time the activity came to an end around their farm, or the farms of their Amish neighbors. The next morning, everything was quiet again. Rebekah and Jacob discussed needs from town. Rebekah had one more day before she planned to return to her sewing shop. Jacob noticed she was edgy. We will all go into town for our supplies. It will be gut for you and the Kinner to have a day away from our farm, said Jacob. He was pleased at her reaction. It will be a gut time to see some of our neighbors who may be in town too, said Rebekah. The Kinner will enjoy the ride in. The day was sunny and warm. Jacob pointed out gathering clouds in the distance. We will take the closed buggy in case we get caught in rain. The family got into the buggy and Jacob went back to get extra blankets. We may need them if the weather changes. On the way into town, they passed the Stauffer farm. Rebekah and Jacob were both very familiar with this farm. Eli had grown up here and the four friends, including Nancy, often spent time around the Stauffer table. None of them resisted the invitation. Do you remember how we seemed to show up at the Stauffers' house at mealtime? Asked Jacob. Rebekah laughed and nodded agreement. I was there so often, said Jacob, that my mom told me to start coming home to eat. I believe she was embarrassed at how often I ate there. They reminisced a while longer. Just as they came into town, they met Richard Blanton. Richard originally came from an Amish community a distance away. He did not have an ideal Amish upbringing and ran away at age 15 to become an Englisher. He found his way to this community with the intent to cause upheaval here. Bishop Daniel Stoltzfus took him under his wing, and though the road back was hard and uncertain for Richard, he became a member of the community. He was married to an Amish woman, Sarah, and appeared to everyone to be an outstanding Amish man in spite of his abusive upbringing. Richard pulled alongside the Byler buggy. He greeted them and then asked if they had been disturbed the night before. My editor wants me to do a story on the events in the community last night. Do you want to add anything? Richard continued to work at the English newspaper office in town. Jacob thought quickly about his answer. We have nothing to say. We will allow the English law to do whatever they think necessary. We do not want to be noted in the newspaper." Richard smiled. He doubted any Amish affected with the uproar would give him anything more than Jacob Byler had. Richard did not miss the look of anger that flashed across Jacob's eyes. One of the hardest parts of re-entering an Amish community was to accept the stoic responses to crime that sometimes infiltrated their way of life. Richard found it hard to accept that no matter what happened, the Amish chose to remain aloof from threatening circumstances. They chose to pray over the situation, and if necessary to confront the individual one-on-one. That happened if the perpetrator was Amish. If outside the Amish community, they chose to not press charges or try to win their case in a court of law, he shook his head in bewilderment. Chapter 7. Peace returns to the community. Jacob vowed to not let the encounter with Richard Blanton disturb his family's happiness with their outing. He told Rebekah he must stop at the blacksmith's shop to have several plow blades sharpened. He had placed them in a wooden box in back of the buggy. "Do you want to go ahead with the Kinner to the general store?" "It will not take me long, and I could join you there." Rebekah told him she had a long enough list to take to the store. "I may not be finished as soon as you, Jacob." She then turned to her children and reminded them to walk, not run in the store. Samuel asked if he could go with Jacob. They agreed, and Jacob stopped the horses to leave his wife and younger children at the store. There seemed to be more people in the town than usual for a weekday. Englishers clustered in small groups stopped talking when Jacob and Samuel passed by them. They greeted several Amish neighbors and arrived at the blacksmith shop. Rebekah, Abram, and Hannah entered the store to note the small crowd that seemed to be in every aisle. She instructed her children to follow her, and she began to fill her large basket. She did not buy canned vegetables since the cellar filled with enough. She thought about teaching Hannah to bake a cake. Her own mother taught her first by using cake mixes. Later, she graduated to making them from scratch the way most Amish women did. She picked up 3 boxes of different flavored cake mixes, 2 large boxes of raisins, and several bags of varied beans. She set the basket on the counter. Rebekah asked for a large bag of flour and one of sugar to be set aside until Jacob joined them. He would take the heavy bags to the buggy. The shopkeeper told her he would take them to the buggy when Jacob arrived. He knew of the serious accident and asked about Jacob. Rebekah chatted a few minutes longer until he was interrupted by other customers waiting to check out. Rebekah saw Hannah looking at the colorful round candies at the end of sticks. She added 3 of them to her items. Hannah's eyes lit up and a smile spread across her face wide enough to cover it. "You may have the candy when we start for home." "You can surprise Samuel with his," said Rebekah. She handed 2 wrapped candies on sticks to her just as Jacob and Samuel came into the store. Rebekah noted the serious look on Jacob's face, but did not ask questions. "I forgot to get spaghetti, Jacob." "Can you manage these groceries and the Kinner?" "We will manage," said Jacob. "Samuel can help me load the large bags onto the back of the buggy. Hannah and Abram can come with us." The shopkeeper called one of his helpers and instructed him to carry the bags out for Jacob. As Rebekah watched the group leave, she noticed Abram found it hard to keep up. She came up behind them and told Jacob Abram could stay with her. She found 2 large packages of spaghetti and added them to smaller items at the counter. "Will this be everything?" asked the clerk. Rebekah told her it was. She reached into her small stringed bag and retrieved the money Jacob left for her. On the way out of the store, Rebekah overheard 2 English women talking. They followed her outside, oblivious to their raised voices. "I heard he used to be an Amish man," said one. The second woman looked at the back of Rebekah's head and could be heard shushing her companion. Rebekah knew she pointed to her when the other woman lowered her voice. She failed to catch the rest of the gossip. She could think of no one who was once Amish and now could be in trouble. She decided they talked of someone from a surrounding community and dismissed the voices. Jacob assisted her into the buggy after putting the children in. The cool wind swirled around them. They were glad Jacob thought of the extra blankets. "Did you get the blades sharpened?" asked Rebekah. "I did. The blacksmith took care of them right away, so that will save another trip back into town." They spoke to one another of the signs of the changing season. Jacob pointed to the darkening clouds overhead. He clicked the horses faster and reached the dirt road into the Amish community. The children licked their candy, and this kept them quieter than usual. Unknown to Rebekah, Jacob learned who the policeman looked for the night before. He kept it to himself and would wait until the best time to tell Rebekah. When they arrived at the turn into their lane, they were met by another buggy. Marion Lapp sat with Nathaniel Bernhard in his buggy. Jacob stopped and greeted them. "You are coming home just in time," said Nathaniel. Marion beamed as she looked around Nathaniel at the Bylers. "We have something for you," she said. When they all arrived at the Bylers' back door, Nathaniel took Marion's hand as she alighted. He then reached for something large that was wrapped in towels and handed it to her. "I will help Jacob unload. You and Rebekah go on inside," said Nathaniel. The aroma of pork chops that seemed to still be hanging in the air reached Rebekah's nostrils. "That smells delicious, Marion," she said. "Samuel, please open the door for us." Rebekah carried her basket inside, and Marion set her large container on the counter. "I will keep it covered so it will stay warm for you," she said. She then put Rebekah's items away while she took Abram into the sitting room. Rebekah pulled out the blocks Jacob once made for Samuel. "Hannah, play with your brooder while I get things in order." The children had finished their candy, and Rebekah reached for a cloth. She pumped water at the end of the long counter, and with wet cloths, she wiped hands and mouths. Jacob and Nathaniel came inside in time to enjoy hot coffee. Rain pummeled the roof when they sat down. Jacob remarked they made it inside just in time. "Marion cooked something delicious for us, Jacob," Rebekah said. She unrolled the heavy cloth to reveal crusted pork chops resting on brown gravy. Boiled potatoes circled the meat, and mounds of carrots were at the end of the container. "It is a small way to say danke for all the help you have given me and my Katie," said Marion. "I do not forget how much time the bishop spent with Matthew either." A brief silence followed until Rebekah spoke. "We want you both to stay and enjoy this meal with us. There is plenty for all of us. I will put some rolls into the oven, and perhaps you. Marion will make more calf." Everyone then sat at the table when food was ready. Jacob bowed his head and prayed praise to their God for the bounty. Nathaniel took note that during the meal, Jacob did not meet Marion's eyes in conversation. Something told him that Jacob's manner had something to do with the upheaval in the community the night before. Nathaniel had spent the day mending fences around his fields. He then went to see Marion and Katie. Katie's finance was there. He recalled John Byler was not as talkative as usual in the Lapp house. Suddenly, he began to put things together. John and Jacob knew something about reasons the English police swept over the Amish community. Nathaniel shook his head, perplexed. Matthew Lapp was in prison several cities away for committing arson at the farm of an Englisher. He relaxed knowing that Matthew was ruled out as a part of the ruckus. The next day, rumors flew around the Amish community. Nancy Schrock came to the Byler farm in the afternoon. Jacob was in the barnyard putting the sharpened blades onto his plow. He hitched one of the horses and put the plow into the storage end of the barn until spring, Rebekah looked up at her friend. "What is it?" Rebekah asked. "You look as if you have something disturbing on your mind." When she took Nancy's hand and pulled her inside, she felt her friend's hand shake. "Are your kinner here?" she asked. "My mom has them at Gross Mommy's house. They are helping clean." Without invitation, Nancy sat at the kitchen table. Rebekah poured 2 cups of hot coffee and placed a plate of oatmeal raisin cookies on the table. She waited for Nancy to calm down. "I know what was going on the other night," she said. "The police are searching for Matthew Lapp. He escaped from prison with 2 others." Rebekah stared at her friend. Visions of the face of Matthew, the day he came into her bedroom, swept over her. She found it hard to believe he had escaped from jail. Her world instantly turned upside down. "There is more," said Nancy. "Richard Blanton has been arrested in town." "We just saw Richard yesterday." What has he done? Rebekah had no idea how or why, but she immediately thought about the newspaper article he planned to write about the police invasion of their community. Did he write something he should not have? Nancy shook her head no. He helped Matthew and the other 2 to escape. Jacob walked in to see his wife and her best friends staring at one another. Both were tense. He had never known them to have an argument. It must be something else, he thought. Then he realized the women had received the news about Matthew's break from jail. Little did he know there was much more to it than the prison escape. He reached his wife's side quickly. Her face was ashen, and he expected her to collapse before he reached her. He sat her down on the sofa. Nancy sat on the other side of her. "Did you know Matthew broke from prison?" Rebekah asked Jacob. "Jay, I heard yesterday he had escaped, and the police tracked him to this area." "Did you know Richard Blanton has been arrested for helping him?" asked Nancy. Jacob's startled look told her he did not know that. She told her friends that Isaac, Nancy's husband, sold 2 originally designed baskets of his to an English family. He knew the man well who told Isaac the story. Richard had been given the job of following Matthew Lapp for a story that was to come out in the springtime. He made many trips to the prison. After some time, he began to sympathize with Matthew. Together, they plotted a way for Matthew to escape along with 2 inmates who shared his cell. "I have heard Richard is very angry," said Nancy. "He could not persuade Matthew to try and make it to the Canadian border. Matthew wanted to come home. He did not realize the way it would turn out. The English law does not let go of an escaped inmate that easily." Rebekah bowed her head in her hands. Jacob began to pray aloud. Everything Marian Lapp had gone through to find the happiness she deserved shattered once more. He prayed for the Lapp family and for Matthew and Richard. At last, Nancy told them she must return to their basket shop. For the Amish community, only faith and time would heal them all. That is what it would take to restore the peace experienced before the advance of Matthew Lapp and Richard Blanton into their private world. Later that evening, Clara and Daniel came to visit. The children were sound asleep, and the adults spoke in privacy in the Byler sitting room. The bishop told them Matthew had been found hiding in the Lapp's barn. His mother had no idea he was there. "It is gut that Nathaniel is there with her. He is strong and steady," said Daniel. "Matthew is back in jail and will be there longer than before because of running away. Richard will go to trial in the English court." The bishop looked at his family. "He is Amish and part of us. We will attend his day in court but will not intervene." They sat in silence, attempting to take it all in, along with the implications of what had happened. Then the bishop spoke again. "Our gut promises us justice for our sins, and only he will judge in truth. He promises us much more, though. He has told us that when we work hard and raise upright Kinner in His way, He will keep all promises of faith, hope, and love that will spread among us when we do His will in all things. Everyone received the message. When God's laws are not followed, evil will prevail. That night, when Rebekah and Jacob lay next to one another, they dismissed the deeds of Richard and Matthew from their minds. Instead, once they placed the two men in their Gut's hands, they renewed vows to follow him and protect his promises kept for their family. "Our Gut is a generous Gut, Rebekah," said Jacob. "It is amazing how much he has promised us, and so much of his generosity is fulfilled every day of our lives." Rebekah nestled closer to her husband. She and Jacob realized they must give Marian and Katie strong support, so they will go forward in peace. After all was said and done, promises of God's life in the community would sustain them all. The end. Thank you for listening. Here at PureRead, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any PureRead book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.